Thank you, Paul. It's a privilege to be with you guys. Transformation Church has an awesome reputation of being a powerful community with a lot of integrity that's really involved on the front lines and really doing awesome work. So you can imagine that it's an honor for me to be here and to be able to speak to you guys. And to start off, I want to ask you all a question, and I'm going to ask you to raise your hand, but if you don't feel comfortable, you don't have to raise your hand. So you can opt out if you choose not to raise your hand on this one. But how many of you, either personally or have a family member or a close friend, someone that's very dear to you, in other words, who has struggled with a mental health issue? If you would, raise your hand. Look at that. Almost everybody in the room. That's just the people that felt comfortable raising their hand. You can put your hands down. So here's my point in asking that question. First is, you see how many people this affects. And second, I did that to begin with because we've got to begin by erasing the stigma of mental health, right? We've got to begin by start putting it out there that we can be honest with our stories. When you guys raised your hand, I raised my hand as well, because in my own life, there are people that are very dear to me that have had struggles with mental health issues, and some of that I can share with you as we go. But I want to start today and talk about some of the cost of mental health issues, the prevalence of it. I want to define a little bit of the specifics, and then I want to talk about how, as individuals and as a church, we can be helpful to people who are struggling with mental illness and mental health issues. So first, let's start with the rates of mental illness. This is really remarkable if you think about it. Depending on what survey or study or methodology you look at, between 1 in 5 and 1 in 4, somewhere around there, of individuals experience some form of mental illness in any given year. That's about 60 million Americans. Think about that. 1 out of every 4. That's why almost everybody raised their hand, because if you think a regular family typically is about 4 people, 5 people, out of a typical number of 4 or 5 people, at least one of those folks is going to struggle with major depression, an anxiety disorder, or some more severe form of mental illness. So the rates of mental health issues are really, really high. And if you look at the really high-end stuff, the really severe forms of mental health disorders, 1 out of 17 people experiences some form of a major severe mental illness, like a schizophrenia, a bipolar disorder. The way to think about that, if you look at this front row, just to give you a sense of that, 1 person on each row here, on average. So we say 6%, but when you think about it, that's really how it breaks down. If we take 1 row, each of these rows, it's about 1 person per each row. And here's something that's also very, very important. If you look at children and adolescents, even younger kids, about 1 out of 10 kids experiences some kind of severe form of mental illness. As you get older, the rates go up a little bit higher, but even among children and adolescents, it's 1 out of 10. The way to think about that is, imagine you go into an elementary school, and you're walking down the hall, and each classroom has 20 kids in it. There are 2 kids in that room that have got a mental health problem, and there are 2 kids in this room, and 2 kids in this room, and 2 kids in that room. It's a lot. And so that's what we're talking about with the rates of this. This is something that affects nearly all of us, all of our families, all of our neighbors, all of our friends. Not that every single person has a mental health disorder or a mental illness, but the rates are so high that it affects nearly every family, nearly every classroom, nearly every community. If you look at the cost of mental illness, the World Health Organization reports that 4 of the top 10 leading causes of disability in the world, in developed countries, where they measure this in the same methodology, are mental health problems. 4 out of 10. So of all the ways that a person could become disabled or knocked out of commission, 4 out of 10 of them are mental health problems. That's huge. It's predicted that in 5 years, major depression will be the leading cause of disability for women and children. And you think, well, why are the rates of depression and other things going up? And it's a big question. And the truth is, the world isn't necessarily getting worse, although that's the perception, but it is a much more stressful world. We have things in our face all the time that are telling us how bad the world is, and we're exposed to things 24/7, and we have many more demands than we ever have before. And we look at the wear and tear on people. We're looking at, within the next 5 years, the major cause, the leading cause of disability among women in the developed countries and children will be depression. The economic cost of untreated mental illness is huge. The untreated cost in the U.S. alone is $100 billion a year. That's not the treatment costs. That's the lack of treatment costs. So the people that aren't getting treatment, that are missing work, losing productivity, having the other kinds of secondary problems that come from a disability, $100 billion a year of cost for non-treatment. So the costs of mental illness are pretty huge. There's a lot of impact on spiritual well-being as well. There's some people, for example, when they become depressed or anxious, it actually does something interesting in that it makes them more dependent on God. It turns them toward God. But there are lots of people that have the opposite reaction. They become distant from God. They feel like God's abandoned them. They feel embittered toward God and toward church communities for lack of support or lack of understanding. And so it can cut either way. There's some people that their struggle with a mental health issue, just like their struggle with a physical health issue, can make them turn toward God, whereas there are plenty of other people that it can make them turn away from God. And there are also some serious psychiatric problems and mental health problems that the nature of those problems can actually affect a person's thinking so much that it affects their ability to reason accurately or well spiritually. For example, if you got someone that has, let's say, schizophrenia or some forms of bipolar illness where there's mania, where the thoughts are racing, you can actually have, in those cases, people that seem on the surface to be very spiritual and highly connected to God, but their thoughts are not based in reality and they're irrational, and they're more of a product of mental illness than they are the product of a deeper spirituality. Doesn't mean that a person can't be a person of faith and have a deep, abiding faith and have a mental illness. In fact, that's very much the case often. But it means that some forms of mental illness can interfere with the ability to reason and to be healthy in a spiritual way. The other thing, too, and I'm going to spend a little time talking about this, is that there are some people that have conditions that are called personality disorders. And those personality disorders can actually affect their ability to use help and support in healthy ways. A personality disorder is a little bit different than other forms of mental illness. So, for example, schizophrenia is a disease process of the brain. But a personality disorder is something that forms over time. Your personality is really two things colliding. It's your temperament and your life experience. So your temperament's the stuff that you're born with. Your temperament is the stuff that you're wired with. So your activity level, your sociability, how regular you are, your mood, all that stuff. And so those of you who have more than one kid, you'll know what I'm talking about, right? So if you have 2 or 3 or 4 kids or more kids than that, same family, same environment, one kid never met a stranger, the other kid you can't get him off your leg. One kid is highly regular, goes to bed at the certain time, wakes at a certain time, does everything certain. The next kid, all over the map. That's temperament. So you take temperament, and the way I think about it is if you look at a big display of knobs and different control panels here, they're all set on different ones. So this kid, it's set on 5 for intensity and 3 for activity level and so on. And this other kid, it's set differently. So you take that temperament and you collide it with life experiences, and out of that, you develop personality. And personality is your abiding, long-standing patterns of relationship. That's the easiest way to say it. It's long-term patterns of relationship. How you relate to people, how you relate to the world around you, how you relate to yourself. Well, there's some people that have conditions that are called personality disorders where because their temperament may have been a certain way, maybe they've been highly intense or highly sensitive or so on, and they have life experiences that may have in some cases been difficult or invalidating or just not a good fit for their temperament, they develop patterns of relating that are problematic. And sometimes those individuals can get into a church community and be highly disruptive, or they can be highly manipulative. And so I say that to say that sometimes as we're talking about a church being a healthy place where we care for people with mental health problems, sometimes a way to care for people, especially when they have those kinds of mental health issues, is sometimes we have to have very clear, strong boundaries. And we have to be warm and caring, but we also have to be very, very clear about the boundaries and very, very firm about where we're not going to get manipulated and taken advantage of and so on. Because that's not only good for the church community, but it's good for that individual. So there's a lot of impact on spiritual well-being. I want to give you a little bit of understanding of how the brain works and how that interfaces with what we're talking about today. Your brain, which is not a really especially good-looking organ, is this wrinkly thing that's up in your head. And your brain is, the best way to think about it, it's the hardware that runs the software. So your brain is this highly complex little supercomputer that has all this stuff happening in there. And it transmits information through electricity and chemicals. Sounds weird, but that's how it works. There are little electrical impulses that make chemical reactions, that make other electrical impulses, that tell different parts of the brain to receive information and so on. It's super duper complex, and so you can imagine that just like your heart or your lung or your spleen or anything, stuff can go wrong with your brain. So when we're talking about your brain, we're talking about the hardware. When we're talking about your mind, we're talking about software. And the mind is the software that the brain's running. Do you follow my analogy? Easy analogy, but that's the idea. And so sometimes mental health problems aren't issues of hardware. Sometimes they're issues of software. And sometimes it's both. And there's an interplay between those things. So for example, if someone has an issue with how their brain is wired, it can affect their mind, the way that they think, the patterns of behavior, and so on. And the reverse is true. Sometimes people can develop certain patterns of behavior or thinking that can actually, in fact, change the structure of their brain. This is something we didn't know until about 15 years ago, that your thinking can actually change your hardware. That your brain is essentially plastic, not in a literal sense, but in a moldable sense, and that because of that, patterns of thinking, for good or bad, can affect the hardware of your brain. Now, there's some conditions that the primary issue is a hardware issue. It has to do with how certain chemicals called neurotransmitters work, or certain patterns of the way the brain lights up. That's primarily the issue, whereas other issues are primarily software issues. And as we go, we'll talk about both those things. So I'm going to talk about common mental health issues that are in adulthood and in children. And obviously, in a 45-minute span of time, I'm not going to be able to hit these in any significant depth, but just so you can understand. And we'll have plenty of time to do Q&A if you need to ask questions about these. But for adults, here are some of the real common ones. Mood disorders are any mood-related problems that affect someone's functioning. That includes major depression, bipolar disorder, and similar kinds of conditions. So major depression is, we call it sometimes unipolar depression, one pole, one end, okay? Just depression. Bipolar disorder is where someone has this end, which is mania and racing thoughts and lots of energy, and this end, which is the depression, and sometimes it alternates between the two. Now, there are variations of bipolar disorder, but that's the idea. Bipolar disorder is almost always a biochemical disorder. It is a hardware issue. It doesn't mean that it can't affect the mind, because it does, but it's primarily its genesis, its root, is a biochemical issue. Anxiety disorders are any time that you have significant anxiety to the point where it affects your functioning. And there are a variety of anxiety disorders, anything from separation anxiety to generalized anxiety, which is this feeling of just being freaked out for no good reason, to panic attacks, to obsessive compulsive disorder. Those kinds of things are anxiety disorders. Substance abuse disorders are considered part of the mental health world, And eating disorders are among the hardest to treat and the most deadly of psychiatric disorders. Individuals with eating disorders have a harder road often, not always, but often in their treatment, and the rates of, in terms of how lethal or deadly they are, very high. Psychotic disorders I need to define a little bit because you'll hear that term. There's a difference between the word psychotic and the word psychopathic, and we mix those words up a lot of times. So a psychopath is a guy who will kill you and not feel bad about it. That's a psychopath. But someone who's psychotic is not a psychopath. A person who's psychotic means that they've lost touch with reality. So a psychotic disorder might be schizophrenia, for example, or other forms of what we call thought disorders. Those are psychotic disorders. Those, again, are almost always biochemical. They're hardware issues. So sometimes when we hear someone say, he was a psychotic killer, they really mean he was a psychopathic killer. And so sometimes we use those terms wrongly and to the harm of people that struggle with thought disorders or psychotic disorders. Almost always this is a disorder of the wiring or of the biochemistry of the brain. And I already told you about personality disorders, and there are a variety of personality disorders that can be very disruptive in families and in church communities and in other communities. You have people that are extremely narcissistic, for example. There's a condition called borderline personality disorder where someone's very unstable in their view of themselves and in their relationships and in their behavior and in their judgment, and it's chronically unstable and often becomes, for that individual, very, very difficult road for them, but also very difficult for loved ones as well. So those are common mental illnesses for adults. And for children, the common ones would include ADHD, which, let me just make a little soapbox comment on this. ADHD is not something that we invented in 20th century America. It's not something that is like, well, back in my day, we didn't have ADHD, and we didn't have all this Ritalin and all. Well, you might not have had all this Ritalin and so on, but you did have ADHD. And ADHD is not every kid in the world has ADHD. Boys have it more often than girls have it. But it is something that affects the frontal lobe of the brain. If you were to look at a scan of a person's brain, you could tell. So let's say we have a 12-year-old kid, and we do a scan of his head. And then we know he has ADHD. And we have 9 other kids that we know don't have ADHD, and we scan their heads, and we put their brain scans up on a light board. You can pick out, if you know what you're looking for, who the ADHD kid is. So it's an issue primarily in the frontal lobe that the brain is underactive in that area at times. It's underactive when it requires sustained mental effort. That's the term. So that's what's confusing to a lot of parents, because parents will say, well, he can play those video games for 4 hours at a time. Or if he's interested in it, then he doesn't have ADHD. It has nothing to do with things that are interesting, appealing, light your brain up. It really shows up on academic tasks where you have to sit there and do a math worksheet. And it has to do with it being more severe than 98% of your peers. So everybody, you know how have you ever done this? If those of you who ever took a psychology class, and everything they talk about you have, you know what I'm talking about? Like, oh my gosh, I have ADHD, I have an anxiety disorder, I have OCD, everything they talk about. I've got every single thing. Well, here's the thing, all of us have little hints of these things. So ADHD is one of these things that we could say, yeah, you know, sometimes I try to sit there and I read a book and I can't get through the page, or I read the paragraph over. That doesn't mean you have ADHD. You might have a hint of it, but that doesn't, you have to be by different objective ratings at the 98th percentile on problems with sustained attention, distractibility, impulsivity, and those kinds of things. So it is a real thing. A lot of times we kind of have this idea of like, well, this is a made-up thing by the pharmaceutical companies to push medicine and all that kind of stuff. But if you've ever known a kid that really had, honest to goodness, ADHD, you're a believer. So that also is, again, not a thing that has to do with parenting or environment or lack of structure. True ADHD, honest to goodness ADHD, is something that comes from brain wiring. There are behavioral disorders where kids have certain patterns of behavior that are so disruptive that it affects their ability to be a student, it affects their ability to be a good family member and that kind of thing. And those kind of disorders can be either. Some of those can be purely disorders of the mind, meaning patterns of thinking, patterns of behavior that aren't necessarily having to do with wiring, or they could be both. You never know. There's lots of talk about autism spectrum as well. Autism spectrum disorders, you've seen increases in that significantly over the past decade, 15 years or so. And there's debate within the research community and the autism community about why that is, about why the rates are higher. But without drilling down onto speculation about, well, it's because we're getting good at identifying better, or there are these reasons for the rates being higher, it is what it is. The rates are higher, and we see individuals with autism spectrum disorder at much higher rates, to the point now where we've got universities that are developing programs specifically for individuals who could benefit from going to college but might need the support. And there are a number of these schools even within our region. And so the movement towards serving the autism community is much higher. There is, I will tell you this, and I'm going to speak on behalf of one of my colleagues, Frank Gaskell, who's kind of the guru regionally on Asperger's. When they revised the manual for the diagnostic manual, they dropped the term Asperger's. And his beef with that was that a lot of individuals with Asperger's see that as part of who they are. Not in a negative way. They see it in a way that helps them understand themselves. And so when you drop that, it's almost like they're taking away that part of their identity. And so, at least among the guys that he has seen, he continues to use that term because he finds it to be something that often individuals who are Aspie or who have Asperger's tend to embrace because it makes sense of their differences. Individuals with Asperger's or high-functioning autism often have difficulty with kind of interpersonal reciprocal communication. They might be socially awkward or odd. And there's a continuum from milder to very, very severe. And so people can be anywhere along that continuum. Back in the 1970s, in the bad old days of mental health, the dominant theory for why a kid was autistic was called the refrigerator mom theory. The refrigerator mom theory said that the reason these kids were the way that they were and had the difficulties they had was because the mother was so emotionally cold that the kid turned inward and closed off. Now, here's the thing. That was the dominant theory as recently as the 1970s. And there is absolutely zero support for it. In fact, there's the opposite. If you study the families of children with autism, often the parents, both mom and dad, are very warm, very engaged, very lovely. And so we had these old school notions that went all the way back into the 1940s and 50s that were rooted in old psychoanalytic thinking about how things got to be the way that they were, and there was no basis for them. What we know is that autism is essentially a brain disorder. It is a condition that an individual if you could either say they're born with or will develop, that's sort of spring-loaded, but it's going to happen. That has to do with how the kid is wired, and certain areas are going to be over-connected in terms of connected neural areas and networks, and some are going to be less connected. So there's going to be a difference in the look of the kid's brain and the functioning of the kid in terms of behavior. The good news is we're finally kind of getting on board with understanding this well. We're finally getting on board with some of the funding, some of the program support. It's not there yet, but the movement is in that direction. You've also got, for children and teens, anxiety disorders, including separation anxiety, where there's a real panic around leaving caregivers, and learning disorders. And kids can also have the same kinds of difficulties that adults did that I described. A kid can have depression and anxiety and the other kinds of substance abuse issues as teenagers, as many of you know. So it can overlap with both of those. Now, here's the key to identifying a problem. The key is that something is a diagnosable condition when it affects a person's functioning. All of us have hints of things. All of us have days when we're sad or anxious or that kind of thing. That in and of itself is not a diagnosable condition. Sometimes we have things that even hint at a bigger disorder. Like, how many of you have ever done this thing where, like, if you scratch this side of your face, you scratch this side of your face, if you can't step on a crack or that kind of like, or you have to push a drawer in just a certain way, and you're like, I must have OCD. Well, here's the thing. Does that affect your functioning? And if the answer is no, then it's not OCD. It might have a whiff of it, it might hint at it, but it's not. Same thing with depression or anxiety or other things like that. We all have these little hints of things, but it's only when something becomes so much that it affects your normal day-to-day functioning or your ability to perform in your role. In other words, the role of life, whatever that would be, a student, a parent, a employee, a boss, or whatever. Once your role is compromised by this condition, then it is a diagnosable condition. That's really the issue, is does it have negative impact on your role or on your severe impact on your quality of life? There are a couple mental health myths, and I could give you a number of slides for this. I picked just 3 because this is very specific to the church. And I'm going to just hit on these, and you can dialogue with me a little bit later if you're not sure or have different views. But the first myth is that mental health problems are almost always ultimately spiritual in nature. I had a guy a couple years back say to me, well, you know, depression, it's almost always, depression's pretty much always a spiritual condition. Like, oh, of course. And I said, well, what do you mean? He goes, well, you know, at the root of depression, it's almost always a spiritual issue. And I said, well, tell me what you mean. And I kept pressing and pressing, and here's my point. I'm not saying that there's not a spiritual component. I'm not saying that there's not a spiritual aspect or intersection. But to say that it is exclusively a spiritual issue is to deny the fact that what we know about how people get depressed is that people have issues with serotonin and other aspects of their brain functioning. Other people have had life circumstances that have been crushing and debilitating. And to kind of say that it is a spiritual condition, period, it sounds good, but it doesn't really hold up to scrutiny. And it also can be very damaging. I've known a few people that have been incredibly on fire in their faith, incredibly committed to their relationship with God, and have attempted suicide, have gotten into very dark holes of depression, have gotten into very, very bad places. And part of that is because their assumption was that ultimately the issue was they had to get right with God, and that would kind of correct this, and that was really it. And instead of seeking out the kind of help that they needed, it drove them down to a worse place. So what I'm saying is, I'm not saying that there's not a spiritual component or spiritual aspects to mental health, but I am saying that to have this sort of very generic, very blanket statement of all mental health issues or all depression or fill in the blank is ultimately a spiritual problem might, in fact, do more harm. Second thing, and this is a myth, is that mental illness can always be solved by Bible study or prayer or just by pulling yourself up by your bootstraps and getting on with it. And I'm all for Bible study and prayer and self-determination, and I'm all for it. But again, you wouldn't say those kinds of things to somebody that had diabetes or high blood pressure or cancer or heart disease, and we're pretending like this is something else that doesn't involve a physical organ of the body that can go wrong. And so, again, I'm very, very glad for those things, and I think when they're incorporated in a healthy way in a person's life can lead a person to greater health. But to say that that's kind of the end of it, like a person needs to just seek God more and pray more and dig into Scripture more and really kind of feeding this idea that all they need to do is get right with God, and that kind of corrects it. And I wish, if you're holding that view, that you could sit in my office for even 2 days and just observe and talk and hear people's stories, because I think you'd come to a different conclusion. Last thing is, there is a myth that most therapists out there pose this tremendous threat to the Christian faith. That most therapists, and I'm talking about like secular or non-Christian therapists, are very much antagonistic to the faith. And they're very much wanting to kind of move people away, as they see the faith as being, a person's faith as being this opiate of the people, and this kind of thing that's leading them toward, being delusional and unhealthy. That's hardly the case. I'm not saying there's not a few people out there that operate like that, but most good therapists operate within someone's point of view. So if someone's coming in, for example, and says that they're depressed and their faith is very important to them, a therapist, even someone who's not a believer, is going to respect that and incorporate that most of the time. I'm not saying all the time, but most of the time. But this idea that these therapists pose this tremendous risk to people and will steer them away from their faith. I will tell you, I've known therapists who are Christian and not, and if someone's coming in, they're having trouble with their marriage, you're not going to get any rates of a not Christian therapist telling someone to leave their spouse than you would with a Christian therapist. It's just, they're going to assess it the same way. If someone's coming in and saying, we're having trouble, we need to work this out, that's what they're going to work on. If someone's coming in and saying, we're having trouble, I'm getting hit and physically abused and it's dangerous in my house, Christian or not, they're going to say, you need to move towards safety first. I mean, it's those kind of practical things. So I just wanted to say that this idea that mental health workers are kind of posing this sort of looming threat just doesn't hold up. All right, a few things. Does treatment work? When people do engage in treatment, we saw that not treatment doesn't work. When people don't engage in treatment, there's a $100 billion a year cost for that. But does treatment work? The answer is, for the most part, yes. Depending on the kind of treatment, the kind of disorder, the condition, it ranges from 70 to 90% improvement. Significant improvement. Improvement to the point where someone is functioning better in their life and in their role. So that's pretty high rate. You think that's higher than chance. So you think someone going in for treatment for major depression, panic attacks, you name it, they have about a 3/4 to 90% chance that they're going to benefit from that experience. That's pretty huge. So yes, the answer is typically yes. Now, some conditions respond slower, some conditions take longer, some require ongoing support and treatment. So I'll give you a couple examples. If someone comes into my office and they're presenting with panic attacks, which are horrible, by the way. Any of you who've ever had a panic attack, it's just the lousiest feeling in the world. So a panic attack's where you just have this feeling like just swamps you out of nowhere, and you feel like you're having a heart attack, and you feel like you're going crazy, and your heart's beating, and you're like that, and you don't know what to do, and you feel like, and you go to the emergency room and all kinds of stuff. It's a horrible feeling. But here's the good news with panic attack. It's one of the most treatable things in all of mental health. So most people come in the door, they're having panic attacks, they're freaking out, they don't know what to do, and I'll tell them, we're probably going to meet 5 or 6 times and it's going to be better. And almost always it is. So something like that, which seems to the person horrible and devastating, honestly, can respond in 4, 5, 6 sessions. But there's some conditions, and it could be anything from some personality disorders or attachment disorders or you name it, that the range of treatment is going to go on for much longer. And you think about that, and that makes sense, right? That mental health might parallel physical health, where there's some conditions in physical health that would be, quickly treated. You walk into your doctor's office, take this antibiotic or do this thing, and you're good to go. And there are other conditions that are just chronic in nature. Same thing's true with mental health. So treatment does tend to work. Now, what are the barriers to treatment? First barrier to treatment is being a dude. That's it. Way more stigma among men with mental health than women, still. And most of my work is with young men. Most of my practice is 16 to 27, 28-year-old guys. And we did a study a few years ago where we took 100 of my clients at random and looked at the charts, and rated whether they had come in on their own or because someone made them come in. What do you guess the rate of them coming in on their own was? Yeah, 4%. 4%. 4 out of 100, so 96% of them came in because their parents or their girlfriend or the court or somebody said, go see that man. Now, the other part that's interesting is of that 100, 75, it was exactly 75, so 3/4 of them were actively hostile or resistant to being there. So you take 100 of these guys, out of that 100, 75 of them are like, I'm not going to talk to that guy, I'm not going to see him. So you think, I got my work cut out for me. So one of the biggest barriers to mental health treatment and seeking it is being a guy. And we're trying really hard to change that. And I'll tell you one of the things that I will say to this crowd that I've said to a number of different groups is when you study resilient people, people that are the most resilient in life, the way that they think is different from other people. And all the ways that they think are exactly what you would expect. They take responsibility for their actions, they set goals, they do all the stuff you'd expect, except for one thing. And that is the most resilient people are the most open to help and support. They're the most open to help and support. So the people that are the most resilient, when they're having a hard time, they let other people support them or help them. And so when we talk about that, whether it's a Navy SEAL or a professional ball player or you name it, a police officer, a fireman, the most macho guy in the world, when you really talk about the guys who do the best are the ones that let professionals, family members, friends, lay professionals, and others help them and support them. And so that's part of what we're doing to kind of say, we need to communicate that message as a way of moving people, guys especially, away from resisting help. Another thing that's a barrier is the stigma, and that's what we're doing just by even talking about it, is we're trying to kind of blow up the stigma. And a lot of the thing, unfortunately, in years past, the church, not this church, in fact, the opposite with this church, but other churches have really played into stigma for mental health and have driven people into secrecy and to seeing this as shameful and to seeing it as such an issue of a spiritual well-being that if they're continuing to struggle, it must mean that they're not right with God. And so you have that kind of stuff happening. But even outside of the church, there's stigma that keeps people away. There's misinformation about it, about what constitutes a problem, what things tend to get better on their own versus not, issues of finance, issues of access. Let me tell you a real quick thing about access. This is super duper important. In almost any state in the country, including North Carolina historically, the rates of suicide are highest among kids in rural counties. So there's a correlation between rural county and rate of suicide most of the time because of lack of access and a little bit more stigma, right? But there's less access, there are less services. Except in North Carolina in the last few years, where Mecklenburg County has the highest rate of teen suicide. And here's why. The reason is because in Mecklenburg County, we shut down the children and adolescent services. We've shut down other kinds of public access for services. The rates per capita, the rates of services for kids in the county is lower. And so it parallels a rural county. There are years where the county would give away a lot of their mental health dollars. And there's a whole thing about that. But the point is that less access is related to obviously less service. And finally, we have alluded to this, bad theology also can affect someone's ability to seek help. If they really have a view that really they've just got to get right with God, they got to pray and so on. And again, I know you're hearing me on this, but I just want to underline it. I love if you're a person of prayer, a person who's seeking out God, a person who's in the scripture. But what I'm really saying is that when that becomes the solution to everything that is related to mental health, that sometimes we need to rethink that. Okay, a couple important considerations, and I'm going to wrap up in about 2 or 3 minutes, and then we'll take your questions. The earlier you intervene, the better. What we know with kids especially is that earlier intervention helps. kids, for example, on the autism spectrum, the earlier you can catch that and intervene, the better you see the trajectory for that kid. Same thing for kids with behavioral problems, kids with emotional problems. And in adulthood, the earlier you can jump on something, the better. Here's my best analogy. If you had heart disease in your family and you caught it early before you had a heart attack and you treated it and you managed it well, your rates of having a heart attack and other heart complications are a lot less than if you went ahead and had the heart attack and then tried to treat it and then had another heart attack and your heart's getting compromised. Same thing with mental health. The earlier you jump on something before you have major moments and major events, the better. So earlier intervention helps. Often treatments need to be multisystemic. I am a psychologist, I'm not a psychiatrist. A psychiatrist is a medical doctor. So sometimes we need medicine, we need the therapy, which is what I do. Sometimes we need the spiritual guidance and direction. Sometimes we need just the friend support. And a lot of times, for me, if I'm the quarterback, I'll look at kind of the canvas of what's going on and say, what components do we need? We need maybe a school piece of it. We need a medicine piece of it. We need all this. And we need to come up with a plan that's more integrated and comprehensive. But sometimes those treatments is not just a matter of, let me go see my family doc and get some Zoloft and I'm good to go. Now, sometimes that's good, but sometimes that's not enough. And the last thing I'll say is that good treatments often don't only require professionals, but also family members and friends and pastors and lay leaders and other people to kind of rally behind and to be on board. Okay, if you're seeking help, let me give you a couple of suggestions. First is I would encourage you to seek a licensed professional. I underline licensed, not because someone who's not licensed can't be helpful, but really if you've got a condition that's bringing you in the door, you want to make sure that you've got someone with a high degree of training and knows their stuff and can distinguish it from something else. A lot of times people come in the door, and this happens all the time with guys. I've got plenty of guys that come in and they've got raging anxiety disorders, and they have no idea what anxiety means. No idea. So they've got all these symptoms of anxiety, and they think they're either depressed, which they might be, or they think it's just anger, or it's all this. But when you really kind of skin it down and boil it down, it's like the root of it is they've got a major anxiety disorder. You need somebody that's going to be able to distinguish that for you and help you kind of distinguish that aspect of it. So you want somebody that's licensed most of the time. You also want a good fit between you and the professional. My business is very relational. So when somebody sits down with me, I always make it easy for them not to come back. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I always make it easy for them to go, like, if this isn't a good fit, you're not going to hurt my feelings, I promise you. Because what you want is somebody to come in who feels like you click with them, they click with you, and they know what they're doing. And so you look for a good fit. So if you walk in the door and you think, oh, that guy's kind of weird, or he didn't really listen to me very well, or whatever, then pay attention to that. You don't have to see them. They're not the only game in town. Go find somebody else that's a good fit for you. The best outcomes for treatment usually have what we call a cognitive component. And a cognitive component is where you help someone change their patterns of thinking. And so that's a question that you also can ask is, do you do a cognitive aspect or cognitive piece to your work or therapy? And the last thing I'll say is, my suggestion is to be open to medicine, but you might want to start with a counselor or psychologist first. A lot of times people will just go to the doctor, get some medicine, and they won't. But a lot of times it might work better the other way, where you have somebody assess it. And sometimes I'll say right off the bat, if it were me, I would go see a medical doctor and get the medicine going. But a lot of times I will also say, let's give this 3 or 4 times and see if we can get a little bit of traction with this. And if we can't get traction, then we'll talk about the medicine. So I would encourage you not to poo-poo the medicine or be down on it as a negative thing, but to really see it as a component that might fit or might not fit. Okay. Being a helpful church, you guys are doing this right now. You're working to destigmatize. You want to work toward showing compassion and friendship. You want to be wise, and the reason I put that up there is that sometimes being compassionate and showing that kind of compassion also means that for some people who might be more tending toward being manipulative or difficult, sometimes that involves setting good limits and boundaries and not to feel bad about that, to feel good about that. Having a healthy theology that incorporates the kind of stuff that we're talking about, and having a clear process of how do you get people help. In other words, how do we direct people to the right people and get them help. Last slide. The toll on families with mental illness is huge. When a family has an individual in the family that has a mental health issue, the wear and tear is absolutely enormous. You guys have heard that the divorce rate in general tends to be around 50%, more or less, sometimes up, sometimes down. The rates of divorce among families with special needs kids who have issues like the ones we're talking about are upwards of 75-80%. The wear and tear is just absolutely enormous. And these are families that need your compassion. They need financial support because it wears them out over the years. They need allies, people that are going to help advocate for them, people that are going to step in for them, people that are going to be their friends and not just provide service for them, but also friendship for them. And they also need breaks. A lot of times with families that have a family member, especially a kid that has a struggle, a lot of times they just need someone that can have the kid for the weekend or come over or give them a break. All that stuff is that family needs, and that's really the frontline work, is that families need that level of support. Okay, I'm going to stop right there, and I'm going to ask Pastor Paul to come up, and we're going to have a little Q&A. So thank you guys for